I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We are on page 33. At the bottom, we're going to be on point G. Now, I was looking at this supposed contradiction, and it's a rather interesting one, because on the surface, this is one of those ones that requires a little bit more thinking. It's a little harder, but I'd like to hear some people's ideas about how we go about harmonizing Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13, and the story in Luke 7, verses 1 to 10. So first of all, I'd like us to read these stories. Since Naomi has gone, I will join in the reading as well. First of all, we'll do Matthew 8, 5 to 13, and so that's 8 verses. Why don't we do 2 verses each? And we'll start with Tammy, go across, and then up to me.
Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, the centurion came to them, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, literally crippled.
And Jesus said to them, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed.
Who are also in a man and authority. Having soldiers and me, and sent to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, to raise, and he does it. Then Jesus heard it. He marveled and said to those who followed, Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel.
And I say to you that many will come from east and west, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. The sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, Go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that very same hour. Now let's come to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. And read verses 1 to 10. I'd like us to see if we can spot some differences, especially at the beginning of the story. This time we'll do 3 verses each. That way I'll only have 1 verse at the end. We'll start with Tammy again. Luke 7, verses 1 to 10. 3 each this time, yes.
Now when he completed all his sayings and married with the people, he entered Capernaum, and the centurion's servant, who was fearful, was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleaded with him to come and heal his servant.
And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof.
Therefore, I do not even think myself worthy to come to you, and say the word, and my servant will be healed. But also an man placed under authority, having soldiers under me, and I said to one, Go, and he goes, and another, Come, and he comes, and to my servant, Grace, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel.
And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well, who had been sick. All right, the difference that we're looking at here is at the beginning of the story. Did anyone catch the main difference between Matthew 8 and Luke 7?
Matthew said the centurion spoke to Jesus.
Okay, Matthew says a centurion. What does Luke say? Spoke to Jesus.
Well, first says that he sent elders to Jews to.
Okay, so he first sent elders. Do we ever read of the centurion actually seeing Jesus in Luke 7? No. He sent elders of the Jews, and then when Jesus agreed to come, then he sent friends ahead out telling him that. And so people have a question. Why does Matthew sort of say that the centurion saw Jesus and Luke says he didn't? And in the end, I often tell people, I'm like, well, is the point of the story the centurion came, or the centurion's faith? And of course, it's a centurion's faith, but this is not one of those minor things that we can just dismiss as, oh, well, this is a minor thing. Because this really does get to the point that stories, for them to actually be true, do need to be told correctly. Now, there is a way to harmonize this. There is an answer to this question. But I want to see what everyone else sort of thinks before I jump in with my own answer to this question. Because I was looking on the page. I don't know whether he actually answers it on the page or not, because I don't think he does. Sort of leaves it up to us to come up with. And I had to look up this one myself because I hadn't come across it before. But what are some thoughts?
It's a good question. I never noticed that before.
Yeah, I didn't either. We don't usually study harmonization, and this can lead to problems.
But you could say that the people that he did send were representing him.
So
He didn't have to physically be there himself. They were his.
okay, so
What's the word?
emissaries or
Or
yeah, that's where I take it. In case those online didn't hear, Tammy was saying that these were his representatives or his emissaries. And so, do we do this today? Are there any examples where that we might come from today that we think of where this might be true, where the representatives represent someone else who's maybe more important? Happens in government all the time. So a press secretary might stand up and say, the premier says this, or the prime minister says this. The prime minister's not there. He directed his press secretary or her press secretary to say something. Those are his words, but he wasn't the one who physically saw them. And that's typically where I believe the difference between Matthew and Luke are. Luke, remember, typically is telling us a historical story. Luke is very big on the details. And he gives us more details. Like we learn from Luke that the centurion actually helped build a synagogue. We never got that from Matthew. Luke is giving us more of a background of the centurion and the elders come along and try to convince Jesus that this man is truly worthy of you coming. And that the elders of the Jews came to Jesus. That's quite unique in and of itself too, because the elders and Jesus typically didn't get along. And the centurions and the elders typically didn't get along, because the elders of the Jews were Jewish religious. As Romans were usually considered Gentiles and dogs, and you don't even associate with them. But this centurion obviously had faith in the God of Israel. He built them a synagogue in Capernaum. And so the elders of the Jews he could very well have been a proselyte to the Jewish religion. He could very well have been that. And the centurion sent them, and they went. And so Luke is giving us a lot of detail, whereas Matthew wants to focus on the faith. I have not found so great a faith in all of Israel. And so Matthew glosses over all of these other things that wouldn't be important to the story, because it doesn't matter whether the centurion built the Jews a synagogue or not. It was this man's faith that was important to the story. And so Matthew glossed over who actually came to Jesus face to face. Because Matthew doesn't say that the centurion physically talked to Jesus face to face. I can talk to someone without ever looking at them. And I'm not talking about just over the phone. I can send representatives and says, Jeremy says this. We do it all the time. Teachers do it. They'll send students to another teacher asking for something. They'll say, Miss Fisher sent me to you because she asked for some glue or something like that. Like, sorry, you might send a student to go and say, Miss Fisher says this. And I've done it before too. Well, they're the ones physically speaking, but they're carrying a message from someone else. And I think that's what Luke's telling us, is what physically happened is the centurion on 2 occasions sent emissaries, sent representatives, sent people who were going to talk to Jesus. The centurion was a dignitary. He was an important man. And so typically, that's the way important people acted. Like, as far as that didn't diminish the man's faith, because the man showed his faith twice in sending to Jesus. The man thought he wasn't worthy even to have Jesus under his house. So maybe he thought he wasn't worthy even to see Jesus either. I don't know that. But you can harmonize these passages. You just have to think about it. It's not as easy sometimes as it seems, where, it's just a misinterpretation of a word, or it's not paying close enough attention to the context. Sometimes you have those, but then we have things like Luke 7 and Matthew 8, a little harder. And so getting used to harmonizing passages is, it gets us into exercise of dealing with some of these questions. Some of them might take a little more time to think about, but they can be thought. Any thoughts?
Luke goes into more depth, saying that the man was ready to die.
Yeah.
Matthew doesn't really say medically tormented. I wonder, verse 10, they added it when Jesus heard.
Mm-hmm.
He marveled and said to those who followed him, they would say Jesus heard it directly from the centurion.
Yeah. Are you talking about Matthew 8 or Luke 7?
Yeah, Matthew 8.
Okay.
I just noticed that Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. And Luke says that being a doctor, he said that he was
Near death, yeah.
But in verse 10, where it just kind of wonder, doesn't lead you to thinking, it doesn't say when they heard from the centurion.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, as far as even verse 13. So verse 13 gets closest, where Jesus said to the centurion, go your way. Now, of course, just because as far as even if he just says to the friends who were there, to tell the centurion this, it's what is being focused on by Matthew and Luke. Matthew's focusing on the centurion's faith, and so he's cutting out parts that are not necessary. Whereas Luke is not only focusing on the centurion's faith, he is focusing on the fact that this man was a Gentile who had been helping the Jews And he was probably a proselyte, which would have been important for Luke's audience. Remember, Luke's audience is a Gentile audience. And showing that Jesus even helped the Gentiles in Israel. And the gospel is for all. And so it's not a problem when we sit down and say, okay, what are some possible ways that this can be explained? We write today differently than the ancients wrote. We just do. And we've got to remember the Bible wasn't originally written to us. If it was written in the 21st century way of writing things, the people in the first century wouldn't have understood it. We can understand the way past cultures wrote because we have their writings, at least some of them. We can understand these things. It's been translated into our language, so we can read it. We can understand these things, but it goes back, I think, to what Bill said a few weeks ago. If you're looking for a reason not to believe, God will send you one. There are plenty of reasons not to believe. Not good reasons, but there are plenty of reasons not to believe. The devil is very good at deceiving us. But when you actually sit down in good faith and say and look at the scriptures, you come away saying, they do agree. They do agree. I may not, it may be taking me a little bit longer. We always love to take shortcuts and get things done right away. Sometimes it takes a little longer. You got something, Bill?
Yeah, I just wonder, Matthew might have been an eyewitness to that.
Could be. Luke wasn't, but...
Yeah, Luke just, like he begins with by saying, Samaritan, the things that are, from the day, from eyewitnesses and ministers.
Yeah. Well, as far as Matthew, it's not Matthew's misremembering it, but I really do think Matthew's giving an overview of the story, whereas Luke's giving us a little bit more detail. You find that a lot in Matthew's writing, where he's teaching us a theme, he's teaching us about faith, and Jesus' miracles here, he's teaching us about those. It's not that he's not concerned with the details, but he's not concerned with the most minute details that don't concern the story. Luke the historian, he's wanting to know, okay, I want to get everything right. I want to get everything right. I want all the details. Give it to me all. Give it all to me. And so the Gospels were written to different groups of people, by different people, inspired by the Holy Spirit, yes. But I think this is another way that we can show that the dictation view of inspiration is flawed. That God specifically dictated every single word that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and all the rest of the writers wrote. I believe he inspired them what to write, and they wrote it in the vernacular and the way that they would write. In Luke's case, the Holy Spirit inspired Luke who to go to, ensured that the story was right, but Luke's the historian, so it sounds like a historian. Matthew is a tax collector who's wanting to teach about Jesus being the King of the Jews, and he's wanting to show that people had faith in Christ. Those details aren't as important. And so Matthew skips them. That's just some thoughts. Next, we're going to come down to point L on page 34. We're going to talk about Jesus' resurrection. There's a lot of interesting discussions about Jesus' resurrection. And if you've ever had the chance to listen to our podcast on the book of John, at the end of that series, there are 2 lessons that are pulled out of the chapters. After the crucifixion, we do a harmonization of the crucifixion stories in the Gospels. And after we've discussed the resurrection in John, we deal with the harmonization of the resurrection stories. in the Gospels, and I'm going to stop using the word stories. I was listening to a YouTube video this week, and the author made a very good point, which was, or the speaker made a very good point, which was, why do children, especially today, in the way that they speak, why are they not believing the Bible? We call it stories. And what do children usually think of stories? Fiction. That's what they think of when they think of stories. That children think of fiction. And so they go to learn about something at a museum. That's fact. We go to church and we read about stories. Gotta find a new word for that. Because I'm as guilty as anyone else is, because adults, we view them as stories. They are accounts. A story, like a newspaper, is a story. It's a newspaper story. It always has been called a story. But for children and those growing up in this generation, stories are not the same as what they would refer to as fact. And so maybe we need to watch our language here so that we're relating to children. These aren't just a bunch of fiction stories. The resurrection accounts are historical. And we need to view them as such. And Christians do. Most Christians do. And I believe we mean good. It's not that we're using bad words, but we might not be using words that are connecting to people the way we think they are connecting to people. So the question is, how many angels were at Jesus' tomb? So we're going to get all four accounts. Tammy can get Matthew 28, verse 2. Bill, you can get Mark 16, verse 5. Henry can get Luke 24, verse 4. And I will get John chapter 20, verses 11 and 12. So we'll start with Matthew 28, verse 2.
And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and came and rolled back the stone from the door, and sat on it.
How many angels in Matthew? At minimum, how many angels? One. All right. Did it say an angel, or did it say? It says an angel. And typically would we agree. What did that angel do?
Came from heaven, rolled back the stone, and sat on it.
All right. So he came from heaven, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. All right. So Mark 16, verse 5. That's fine.
And entering into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, arrayed in a white robe, and they were amazed.
Yeah, everyone's going to say young man there. I think it's reasonable to assume this is an angel dressed in white. But he looked like a young man. In other words, angels we know take on forms that we can see. Because spiritual beings we cannot see with our senses. Now, how many are here? How many angels are here?
Well, that's what the New King James says they saw.
Well, they being, I think it's the women here, right? They is double, but it's a young man.
Yeah.
So we'd have one. Now, where is this one?
Sitting on the right side.
Right side of what?
Well,
I guess we have to go back a little bit to know where we are.
Or we're inside the tomb.
yeah.
We're inside the tomb. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Sitting on the stone.
All right, so the angel, we have Matthew talking about the angel sitting on the stone. Mark talking about one angel sitting in the tomb. All right, now let's go to Luke 24. And we get verse 4.
And it happened, as they were greatly perplexed about this, that behold, two men stood by them in shining garments.
Okay, how many we got here?
Two men.
Two. Now, where were they?
They must have been in the tomb too.
Two men standing by them in shining garments.
Well,
Yeah.
that them would be the ladies.
Pardon me?
Them would be the women.
Yeah, we're still talking about the women. And so we had, let me go back. They went in the tomb, did not find the body, and it happened they were greatly perplexed about this, that behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. Okay. So we're in the tomb. Mark spoke of 1 man. Luke spoke of 2. Okay. But remember, Mark's man's talking about the one standing on the right. Mark's very specific where this one was. And Luke is saying, well, no, there are 2, and they stood by them in shining garments. Now let's go to John 20. John 20, verses 11 and 12. But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and she wept. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. And she saw 2 angels in white sitting on one at the head and the other at the foot, where the body of Jesus had lain. Now, I will note here in John 20 that this is a different time. We need to note in John chapter 20, this sight of Mary Magdalene here, she's not with the women here. Peter and John have come and gone, and they didn't see any angel there. Or maybe they did. Did they? No. No, they didn't see an angel there. So we can already figure out what's going on with Mary. Not the same account. Different time. So we can get rid of John's account because it's not occurring at the same time. That is explained why there are 2 in John. Now we still have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew and Mark talk about 1, and I think we've sort of got the idea that we're talking about different places in Matthew and Mark. One's outside the tomb, one's in the tomb. But then we have Mark and Luke. Mark and Luke are both in the tomb. Mark says 1, Luke says 2. How do we deal with those?
Yeah, nothing in the one sitting on the stone.
Quite possible. I hadn't thought of that. But it's very quite possible. We know that there were at least 2 angels there. And so perhaps the one who was sitting on the stone came in. That's actually a pretty good explanation I had not thought of. Where I was coming down is, where does Mark say there was only 1? Mark specifically talks about an angel standing on the right side. Luke's not giving any information as to where they were. They were just standing by the women. They were 2 men. So perhaps it's as Tammy says, that the angel stood out, who's outside, came in, and now there are 2 accompanying the women. Whereas when the women went in, there was only 1. Possibility. Or it's a possibility that Mark only was focusing on the one who was on the right side, and that was all that was important. Because if we go back to Mark 16, if we go back and why would Mark focus on this one angel? Because this is the angel that spoke. He said, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, whom was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee, where you will see him. There you will see him, as he said to you." So why is Mark focusing on this one angel? Because he was the one who spoke. When we go to Luke 24, and we had verse 4, when we get verse 5, it says, "They said to him." Well, when we said "they said to him," does that mean both of them spoke at the same time? No. No. There were 2 people there. They said to them. We use that phrase all the time, too. One person might be speaking, but he's representing the whole group. So we say they spoke. They said. And so it's the same message. So Mark focuses on one angel. Luke says there were. Luke again gives us more information, but there were 2 in the tomb. Whereas Matthew and Mark do not. Not a contradiction, just a matter of more detail in Luke. And then, of course, John's at a completely different time frame, so we don't even have to compare that, because whether or not there were one or two angels when the women were there, Mary Magdalene had gone and come back, and so there could be any number of angels when she saw them, and there would not be any contradiction with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Tie into that, let's get how many women went to the tomb. This is another one of people's favorite ones. Let's go to Matthew 28. We'll get Tammy to get verse 1.
Matthew is the only one that mentioned the guards also.
Yes, Matthew's the only one that mentions the guards, because Matthew's going to come along and the only one who's going to mention the Pharisees bribed the guards. Matthew's the only one who gives us that detail.
To the point to make where they were all the resurrection, no doubting that Jesus rose from the dead.
No.
But the fact that you even said before that the writers were all different men, different backgrounds, they all wrote to different people. If you and I told a story that we saw outside, I doubt it would be exactly the same.
No. But it would tell the same story.
Yeah.
But you'll notice things that I won't. You'll focus on things that I won't. Maybe because of your background. You're as a truck driver. You may have noticed some things that I'm not a truck driver. So maybe if you were telling about an accident, you may have been able to better estimate the speed because you were a professional driver. Might have been noticing some things about the drivers because you're keen on looking at that, whereas I'm not. Wasn't my purpose. So, yeah, I think that's good. Let's go to Matthew 28, verse 1, though, and talk about the women. Tammy, you want to get verse 1?
Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb.
All right, so how many people are here, specifically spoken of? 2 Marys. Now, I want us to note, does Matthew and Mark say it was only these 2 Marys? No. In fact, later on, he said, like as far as we get more women, like as far as they're implied that there were probably more women. But again, Matthew's focusing on Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. If you go back into chapter 27, why is he focusing on these 2 Marys? Because they were the ones who saw where the tomb was. Back in verse 61 of chapter 27, Mary Magdalene was there and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. But if you back up to verse 56, among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. There's 3 women listed there. And in fact, verse 55 says many women. But why does Matthew focus on 2? Because they saw the tomb in chapter 27. So we have at least 2 women. Let's come to Mark 16 and verse 1. And we'll get Bill.
Mark 16:1. Now when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint him.
How many women here? At least.
These 3.
At least 3. So we got Mary Magdalene again. We have Mary the mother of James. Perhaps she's the other Mary from Matthew. But of course we also know there were many Marys. And Salome. And we don't know who Salome is from Mark's account. At least I don't think. Actually, wait just a sec. This might be a 3rd Mary. Verse 47 of Mark 15 says Mary the mother of Joseph observed where she laid. So this might actually be a 3rd Mary. Mary the mother of James. And so there are many Marys here. But we have at least 3. What was that? I went back to Mark 15:47.
No, when you went back
Oh, yeah.
to Matthew 27:56, there was Mary Magdalene mother of James and Joseph.
Oh, okay. All right. Maybe that's it. Okay. Okay. But I know there are at least 3 Marys, because Mary, the mother of Jesus, is also there. And John will make mention of her as a separate Mary. But we also, we know there's Mary and Martha, from the Gospels. Is this one of those Marys? I don't know. She's never Mary and Martha, the Mary from Mary and Martha, is never identified as the mother of anyone. That doesn't preclude her from being one. But we never read of her in that way described. And whereas here we have a lot of Marys. But anyway, what I want from Mark 16 is there are at least 3. Luke chapter 24, verse 10.
It was Mary back then, Jonah, Mary, mother of James, and other women with them. To the 3 saints to the apostles.
Okay, so how many we got here? Yeah, we have 3 named and other women. So we have at least 4. But other usually would probably bring us up to 5 or 6, if not more. The other women. We have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James again, but we have this Joanna here that we'd not read anywhere else. Salome, it will be included in that because we also had that from Mark. Like I said, there's different women. Now let's come to John 20. John 20. Verse 1. John 20, verse 1. Now at the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away. Mary Magdalene's the only one mentioned here, not the other women. And so the way I, in the harmonization in the Gospel of John, put the picture together is, you have the group of women, all of them come to the tomb. They were all wondering how they were going to move the stone, because it was a heavy stone. And when they get there, the stone, the earth, they felt the earthquake, the stone was moved. Mary Magdalene, according to John, left. She was there, saw the stone removed, but then fled to get Peter and John. She didn't see the angels. That's why later on in John 20, she doesn't know where the body of Jesus is. The other women did, because they saw the angels. They spoke to the angels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are recording everyone but Mary. Whereas John focuses on Mary Magdalene alone. John is, in this passage, is really focusing on Mary Magdalene. We don't get Peter and John really coming to the tomb. We get them implied in Luke. It's implied by the men on the road to Emmaus. We don't really get that account. John is focusing on one specific part of the resurrection story. None of these gospel writers exclude other women. They just, again, are focusing on a select few. Luke, again, provides us a little bit more detail, whereas Matthew, Mark, and John focus on certain women for their own purposes. None of the Gospels say, though, that only Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, or only a certain number of women. They all leave it open, focusing on a group. And it's sort of like Bill's example earlier. He might focus on a certain number of people, where I might focus on a larger group. It all comes from perspective and the stories that they're trying to tell. Not a contradiction, but it is something that is interesting to consider and to make note of.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to